All right, so can the US and China escape Thucydides Trap? So, what is this trap to begin with? It's basically when a rising power kind of threatens to displace a ruling power. And where this comes from is uh, is he's kind of sometimes known as like the father of history in a way, as Thucydides, that is, because where this whole idea kind of originates is from the Peloponnesian War, where it was the rise of Athens that threatened Sparta in ancient Greece and so on. But basically, this is coming from a book called Destined for War by Graham Allison. Here's the cover of mine, at least. It's an old library book. But yeah, basically that's what this whole thing's about, and it's actually a thoroughly well researched. And there's a lot of references to. So, who is Graham Allison? So he's the founding dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and he was Assistant Secretary of Defense and advised the SecDef from Reagan to Obama. So, pretty high up there for quite some time, to say the least. But excuse me, I'm doing these early in the morning this time. So basically what this whole book is, and to take a quote from his own preface, so reviewing the record of the past 500 years, the Thucydides Trap project he directed at Harvard had found 16 cases in which a major nation's rise has disrupted the position of a dominant state. In the most infamous example, an industrial Germany rattled Britain's established position at the top of the pecking order a century ago. All right, so this is actually World War One, I think that he's talking about. And we'll get into it earlier. He has whole tables and charts of everything explained, and we'll get into that later. So basically, he found that of these 12, so 12 of the rivalries ended in war, and 4 of them did not. To war throughout the past 500 years or so, this has specifically happened. It was 5,000. Anyways, so one thing to note is, yes, I started off the video with about kind of the U.S. and China, right? But this isn't a book specifically about China and this whole thing. It's about the impact of a rising China on the U.S. and the global order is basically what it's about. So he likes to repeat throughout the book that this does not mean that the U.S. and China having a war is inevitable, from kind of like a geopolitical perspective. As we've noted, of the 16 cases that he has, only 4 of them didn't end in war, right? So basically the point of Thucydides' trap is neither fatalism nor pessimism. Instead, it points us beyond the headlines and regime rhetoric to recognize the tectonic structural stress that Beijing and Washington must master to construct a peaceful relationship. And so he proceeds to give like similarities between the US and China. So he says they're both driven by a common ambition to make their nation great again. Identify the nation ruled by the other as the principal obstacle to their dream, basically kind of putting themselves at odds with each other. They both take pride in their own unique leadership capabilities. They see themselves playing a central role in revitalizing their nation, have announced daunting domestic agendas that call for radical changes, and have fired up populist nationalist support to drain the swamp of corruption at home, and confront attempts by each other to thwart their nation's historic missions, right? And so basically what he talks about throughout the book is, and he makes a lot of similarities between the US and China. Not now necessarily. He has a whole part where it's basically talking and comparing China today to the US at basically the turn of the 20th century, pretty much around like Teddy Roosevelt. But to not get ahead of ourselves, so I can get to the next part. But part 1 is basically just talking about like the rise of China in general, where he gives a bunch of information about like how this has gone about, more or less. He talks about deep sleepers, which he defines as individuals with whom the agencies have established a relationship, but whose assignment essentially consisted of going to live and prosper in a foreign country so as to develop a full understanding of its culture, people, and government, with a commitment to be helpful to their careers in unseen ways. The agencies only ask that the individuals that, when called upon unobtrusively, perhaps just once or twice in a decade, they would provide their candid insights into what was happening in the country and what was likely to happen in the future. So basically, like, having someone there that's like lives there and kind of like understands it a bit more than, people from the outside, because you learn an obnoxious amount more, and just really kind of truly understand like cultures and people when you're actually living there, as opposed to just like reading them in a book and so on. So there's that. So, I can kind of give a bit of a personal story with that too, where I was an exchange student in high school. So I went to Germany for about a month, and what I learned in a month there was pretty much, I probably learned more in going to Berlin for a month than I did in, like 3 years of studying German in high school. So there's that. He also talks about, to get back to the book, basically the US and China today, and basically like compares that relationship to like the US and Britain in about 1860 to 1913. So kind of after the Industrial Revolution and going into World War One. And then he talks about basically, some of the US's fears about basically like how the US could become number two in a way. So he gives graphs and charts and so on. So like basically saying, comparing China as a percentage of the United States in various things. So like, for example, GDP, he shows in 1980, China's GDP was about 7%, whereas in 2015, this book, for reference purposes, was published in 2017. So about a year into the first Trump administration. But in 2015, that GDP number went to 61%. And then he shows imports percentages went from 8 to 73% respectively, same years. Exports were 8 to 151%. And then reserves were 16% to 3,140%. And again, those numbers are all like China's numbers as a percentage of the US's numbers. So it's kind of showing a comparison that way. There's that. And then I went through, because he talks about purchasing power parity, basically, kind of like giving a apples to apples comparison for like GDP numbers in this case. And he uses those to compare the US and China. And the great thing about this one specifically is like, he does 2004, 14, and 24. And again, this book was published in 2017, so the 24 numbers are estimated, but since it's 2025 now, I was able to actually find the actual numbers, so not the estimated ones, and they're not as bad as his predicted ones. So talks about GDP and purchasing power parity in billions of dollars. And so basically, to show the discrepancy, he has China at about 5,760 billion, and then so it's like almost 6 trillion, and then the US is just over 12 trillion. And then estimated in 2024, he had China at basically 35.5 trillion, where the actual numbers were 33. And then the US was at 25, about 25 even, trillion again. And the actual numbers were just over 29, according to a source from the IMF, basically. But to continue, again, so the reason why he talks about PPP, purchasing power parity, is because it, quote unquote, provides the best available starting point for comparisons of economic strength and well-being between countries, especially ones that are kind of drastically different. So this isn't just like major countries like US and China comparison. This is Data from like the IMF, a lot of it is. So there's that. That's pretty much all I'll say about the rise of China, because a lot of the book too is he talks about like lessons from history. So for that, we're going to lean mostly towards the Peloponnesian War. Again, like ancient Athens versus Sparta. It's kind of like, the same era of, you see those movies like 300 and that sort of thing. Because that was really when Thucydides was exiled from one of the two. It's been a hot minute since I've gone over that stuff. But basically, beforehand, like Athens and Sparta were both fighting off the Persians and so on. Long story short, Thucydides got exiled and then basically wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War, kind of seeing from almost an outsider's perspective. More or less. That's not really the purpose of this video, so I'm not going to keep going too far in depth into that. But, covered my light. So, to quote, so he kind of talks about the dynamic between Athens and Sparta, basically that emerged from this. So, to quote, having combined arms in a great war to expel the Persians, he writes, Athens and Sparta set out to manage their strategic competition peacefully. They successfully resolved a series of crises that threatened to ignite war, including negotiating a grand 30 years peace. They recognized that striking differences between the two states' cultures, political systems, and interests made vigorous competition unavoidable. But they also knew that war could bring disaster and were determined to find a way to secure their interests without it. And as we know, that failed eventually, but they definitely tried. So basically the main storyline, and he says this is kind of Thucydides' main storyline with his book, History of the Peloponnesian War. So he says that the gravitational force that pulled Athens and Sparta towards their collision, the relentless rise of Athens, and Sparta's growing sense that this was undermining its position of predominance in Greece. All right, so it's really kind of, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I want to say like, you and your little brother or your little sibling or whatever have the same hobby or sport or do the same thing or whatever, and then your little brother suddenly starts getting a lot better than you, sort of thing. And that's sort of kind of the dynamic, at least to some degree, right? And so with that being said, for these, and kind of learning from a history, because he has his whole appendix. There's a whole appendix to where he literally just goes through each of the 16 cases that he has and just talks about it, right? So he only does the past 500 years for the cases, right? Even though this trap goes back basically and since the Peloponnesian War. So mostly because, like to go that in depth into God knows how many dozens of cases like this could pop up, especially if you kind of extrapolate to like global history and so on. But he starts off in the late 15th century, where basically it was between Spain and Portugal, and just kind of like keeps going. So for example, like the French and the Habsburgs, later on the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire, then the Habsburgs in Sweden, and just keeps going until we get to like, World War I, to the Cold War, that sort of thing. But I don't like showing charts, but just so you guys can have somewhat of an idea of what it looks like. Obviously you won't be able to like actually see with me just holding this up. But yeah, it's basically just like a chart showing it all. It's in the appendix as well. Appendix 1, because there's multiple ones of those, because again it's like dozens of pages of references and notes and that sort of thing. But yeah, so for example, I just flipped to the Appendix 1 to show Soviet Union, France, and UK versus Germany, mid-20th century, so World War II. And then literally it's just like very structured, like the period, ruling powers, the rising power, the domain, what they're basically fighting over, and the outcome, and then just like, you know, kind of at least a few pages about each one, the brief history, and like specifically like not necessarily the history of the event. It's more of like a few pages about the dynamic. So like about Thucydides' trap and like kind of how that came to be and why they went to war and that sort of thing. So now for the somewhat more applicable part for us today. So kind of, he calls this part the gathering storm. So basically this is where he's comparing China today to like the US during like Teddy Roosevelt's time. Somewhat, and he uses a lot of the things that, you know, Teddy did as examples. So he compares, let me not get ahead of myself. So he talks about the Spanish-American War, the Monroe Doctrine, and then also like the border dispute between when we got Alaska and British Columbia, trying to really get that like bottom southeasternly part of Alaska. So to talk about the Spanish-American War, he says the United States defeated Spain before the end of August and signed a peace treaty in December. For Spain, the terms were severe. So this was when we gained Cuba, or when Cuba gained its independence and Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the U.S. So we've had the Philippines and so on, or we don't have them anymore. I'm not going to go into that. Again, sorry, it's pretty early in the morning, so... But anyways, so to continue sensing what the definitive Roosevelt biographer Edmund Morris describes as the circlings of a distant predator, and suspecting that Germany sought a permanent naval outpost in Venezuela, President Roosevelt seized the occasion to send Europe an unmistakable message. And basically telling them, you know, like, if, to quote him, he says, if he does not instantly withdraw his warships from Venezuela, I shall not hesitate to use forces at my command to crush them. And basically goes on to talk about Roosevelt's, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So this one specifically was kind of like Germany I don't want to say interrupting, but like getting kind of nosy into Venezuela for that part. And then proceeds... So, to take a direct quote from Roosevelt about the Monroe Doctrine to kind of give some rhetoric to it for the comparison is, of the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt wrote that it is not a question of law at all, it is a question of policy. To argue that it cannot be recognized as a principle of international law is a mere waste of breath, right? And then proceeds to talk about like what TR did for like the Panama Canal and the and then later on the Alaska boundary dispute between us and basically British Columbia, and then making his own corollary and that sort of thing. But basically where he goes with this is drawing the similarities between like what we did in the very beginning of the 20th century to what China's kind of doing today. So he talks about, as he says, realizing China's dream. So he gives kind of 4 points of what this dream is. So he says that basically China wants to revitalize the party, cleansing it of corruption, restoring its sense of mission, and reestablishing its authority in the eyes of the Chinese people, right? And then 2, he says, reviving Chinese nationalism and patriotism to instill pride in being Chinese. 3, says engineering a third economic revolution. So she knows this will entail politically painful structural reforms to sustain China's historically unsustainable rates of growth. And finally, he talks about reorganizing and rebuilding China's military so that it can be so it can, to quote, fight and win, that sort of thing. So basically he likes to, again, he's comparing a lot of what like China's doing today to like what TR was trying to do then, and compares rhetoric and that sort of thing. So there's that. Now, this video is already 20 minutes, and so like, if you can't tell, I don't like to go too far in depth into everything, because that's also like, you know, the video is going to be really long, and you know, basically I don't want to say the words for him, but anyways. Oh, it's also fun that and this is a direct quote. So despite their many differences, the US and China are alike in at least one respect. Both have extreme superiority complexes, which we do tend to have sometimes, especially like, at least we're definitely perceived as such, going other places. But he talks about actual rhetoric and quotes that he uses. So like kind of like ideas of like between the cultures. So talking about America and China's like self-perception. So like he says, America believes themselves as number one, whereas China is the center of the universe for the culture, which kind of an aside, and I won't go too far into it, but like a lot of the studies that I've done into like Douglas MacArthur and like the Japanese side of World War II or what on, or so on, it's kind of like the cultural part for the I don't want to say just the Eastern world, but anyways, that kind of center of the universe with like the emperor and so on is kind of like, it's a reoccurring theme over there. It's definitely part of the culture. So another one, so core values, he talks about America's is like freedom, China's order, their view of government or form of government, talks about those, talks about time horizons and the differences between us and them. So he says like America is very much a like immediate like now type of thing, whereas the Chinese are very like extrapolate through history in a way. So like, you know, you can have like 100-year plans and so on, because kind of like how the culture views time in a way. It's a lot more patient than we tend to be. But anyways, we're going to leave that one there because we need to get to the good part, which is, probably should have said this earlier too, but he says in part 4, which is basically like why war is not inevitable between the two countries, and then he gives 12 clues as to basically, I don't know, as why it's not inevitable. So for one, he talks, clue 1, so higher authorities can help resolve rivalry without war. Basically, it's 12 clues, like basically to maintain peace between the two countries. For this, he says subordination to international authorities has substantial limits. So like those, not just like, not NATO, but like the IMF, those are just ones popping off in my head right now. Talking about those, and just subordination to kind of international entities in a way can help, but it has limits, because, you know, especially when you're talking about like international kind of policy and what you're doing, you know, there's definitely some jurisdictional issues that can arise. But nevertheless, to continue on the quote, to the extent that states can be persuaded to defer to the constraints and decisions of supranational authorities or legal frameworks, as the rulers of Spain and Portugal did in the 15th century. These factors can play significant roles in managing conflicts that would otherwise end in war. So they're not going to be an end-all be-all, but they can definitely help to some degree, at least. 2, so states can be embedded in larger economic, political, and security institutions that constrain historically normal behaviors. So kind of the same as 1, but he talks about, goes back into the world of Teddy Roosevelt for a bit, explaining his kind of part in that. Clue number 3, so wily statesmen make a virtue of necessity. and distinguish needs and wants. So he talks about basically the contest between the U.S. and Canada for that fat tail of Alaska that we were talking about earlier, for that border dispute. For clue 4, he talks about how timing is crucial for the whole. I mean, that's pretty much everything. It seems in like geopolitical negotiation, I guess, in a way. So for that, he says, by the time the necessity for action is obvious to all the players whose support or acquiescence is required, the cost of effective intervention has risen, sometimes to levels that make it prohibitive. So basically, like, taking care of this before the rivalry becomes too strong and there's really nothing you can do about it to really kind of save face in a way. To kind of like prevent conflict to begin with, or not conflict, but prevent like an all-out war, because there's already conflict. But anyways, clue number 5. So cultural commonalities can help prevent conflict. So basically, like, one of the things that really helped the U.S. and the U.K. During their kind of conflicts earlier on that they talk about in the history part of it is, like, we're both very similar cultures, more or less, at least as compared to like the U.S. and China. So we're a lot more similar to the English than we are Chinese. But there's that. Also talks about the Soviets and the Cold War as a part of that too, because that's a good comparison. But anyways, so clue number 6. So there's nothing new under the sun except nuclear weapons. So basically, his only thing is, nuclear weapons have no precedent, like historically, at least to the extent that they do today. Won't go too much into that specifically because, the video is already 30 minutes. And I'm sure there's plenty of stuff about nuclear war and the politics around that. So clue number 7. So MAD really does make all-out war madness. And for that, MAD as in mutually assured destruction. Again, calls back to the Cold War. Clue number 8. So hot war between nuclear superpowers is thus no longer a justifiable option. Because, if we're all just going to die anyway, what's the point? So basically, how he makes this analogy is he basically calls us inseparable Siamese twins for this. So this means both must compromise in ways they would otherwise find intolerable and restrain themselves and their allies from taking actions that could escalate to all-out war, because mutually assured destruction. Clue number 9. So leaders of nuclear superpowers must nonetheless be prepared to risk a war they cannot win. Again, talking about how, neither nation can actually win a nuclear war, because once you start setting off nukes in both countries, there's kind of not much to pick up the pieces, and basically compares it to a game of chicken. Just so you know, like the game where like two people get into cars and drive towards each other. Whoever swerves first loses. Clue number 10. So thick economic interdependence raises the cost and thus lowers the likelihood of war. Basically, like having an actual war with China between the U.S. and China would significantly, we'll say, degrade the economic power of both in a way, or at least how well the economies are doing. So clue number 11, so alliances can be a fatal attraction. Again, we kind of learned this in World War I-ish, where kind of like an intricate web of treaties and alliances and so on can really kind of pull you into things you don't want to. And finally, he says domestic performance is decisive. So he says 3 factors count most. So economic performance creates the substructure of national power. Competence in governance allows mobilization of resources for national purposes, and national elan or spirit sustains both. So there's those, his 12 things, and I'm pretty much going to leave this here. So this one I have gone through twice, but it's been a hot minute. I did this one a few years ago, and part of the reason why I wanted to do it again was because, well, seems like the video somehow disappeared, or I'm not really sure what happened with it, but I kind of was going through, kind of making an inventory of all the book reviews and stuff that I've done, and realized that this one was not there. So, but anyways, this was kind of a little bit into Thucydides' Trap and so on, and is the U.S. and China like we're actually destined for war, or can we not deal with that? Obviously, he's going to say it in a much more he'll say it in a much better way than I. But that's pretty much the end of it. For once more, here's the cover, so you guys can see that, at least on the one that I have. But definitely a good read. The audiobook's good as well. He does a really good job explaining, again, like, the actual dynamic, not just like the history in a way. But anyways, that being said, as always, other books and stuff up in the corner, and I hope to see you guys on the next one.